artist with papermaking, textile, craft, and specifically how it relates to our own cultural identity. And I'm currently an MFA student in design studies in the School of Human Ecology. And so making and craft is something that we all kind of carry, even if you don't think that you're creative in any way. I would argue that just by how you grow up and the way that you touch things and question things and learn about craft, in some way we are creative in that way. And so by touching objects, questioning materials, and understanding our cultural histories, we kind of begin to unearth these questions about craft and where they come from. And so at an early age, I kind of found myself always drawing and always making things with my hands. And it was almost a place of a way to kind of understand who I was, but also kind of struggle between three different cultures. My mom is Chinese and my dad is from Vietnam. And so I was born in the US. And so kind of walking this precipice between like understanding my own identity in my artwork has always been something that I found myself stumbling upon. And I'm just going to be introducing kind of like the very beginnings first before we get into hand paper making traditions in Vietnam. So I did my BFA in painting and sculpture, and I was always questioning my materials. I was using polyurethane and spray foam to make sculptures and collecting different things, but also painting with oil and acrylic and not really knowing where my materials are coming from. And this was a piece that I did in Wyoming. I was taking the sculpture and putting it into different areas in the landscape and questioning it. The color was a stark contrast to the landscape, but the materials were also very different. You have like stark landscape and nature versus like plastic, polyurethane, and acrylic. And so I was always questioning, do I really know what these materials are coming from? Shortly afterwards, I was plugged into working with a paper lab at the University of Illinois, making paper out of agricultural waste. And so I spent a lot of time learning about Western paper making. I spent a lot of time with my dog in the paper studio, and we were making paper out of hemp, corn, and miscanthus, and a variety of other garden waste and agricultural waste that's abundant in the Midwest. I found myself falling in love with paper making, and so I felt like a kid again. I really felt like I knew exactly where these materials were coming from the beginning process of harvest and collecting the materials to forming a sheet of paper. And I realized that I could also make my own pigments and collect raw material to build sculptures with pulp and make collages. And so this is kind of where I landed myself in when I was starting paper making. But I had only ever learned Western paper making, and this was about 7 years ago was when I first started picking up the first technique in Western paper making. And again, as a curious person, I began to question where this craft originated from. And I had only ever practiced Western paper making, which has different types of materials, equipment, and there's similarities, but the equipment in the sheet forming process is really different. And so this lands me to these beautiful images here. And these were the first images that were made over 2,000 years ago in China. These were first documented by a port official named Kai Lun. He kind of started gathering different materials and stumbled upon making the first sheet of paper. And this was in 105 CE. And I just love these images because they are paper making as it is right now is pretty much the same as these images. It has been unchanged. And this has existed for these documents here has existed over 2,000 years, but it could have existed even further than that before the first documentation. And so China is, just to give us a framework, that paper making was first documented in the Yunnan province, which is where it's highlighted in the yellow there. And you can see how closely it borders Vietnam. And in the Yunnan province and in northern Vietnam, they share ethnic minority groups, they share traditions, they share culture. And just by geographical proximity, we can probably understand that papermaking, when it first started, probably would have spread first to the neighboring regions before it started getting spread out to the rest of the world. And the significance of paper, we all have handled paper in our daily lives through computer paper, books, and different texts. But it really was the vehicle to really document history and start to kind of globalize our histories and the texts and images that we have today. To give us a little bit of a framework of the map, just so we all know the regions that I'm going to be talking about, because it's really helpful kind of to know where we are. And so Hanoi, which is the capital, that's the northern region, and that's primarily the region that I'm going to be focusing on because I did my field work there. And Hue is the old imperial capital. So I did some of my, I did a residency in Hue, and I worked with some paper makers and researchers there as well. And then Ho Chi Minh, which was previously Saigon before 1969, is southern Vietnam. And my dad is actually from the south of Vietnam. And with Vietnam, this is something that I learned while I was also over there, is that there are over 54 ethnic minority groups across North, Central, and Southern Vietnam. They range in different traditions and cultures and abundance in different motifs and symbols in textile. There's also variances in different papermaking techniques all across the country through the ethnic minority groups. And Vietnam is also rapidly industrializing. So with papermaking, papermaking once being in the centers of Vietnam have been pushed out of the city centers, and a lot of the documentation has been extremely displaced. And Vietnam, as it is now, there's a history of war with Vietnam, but there's also been 3 different successive wars after the Vietnam War, which we're probably most familiar with, but there was a war involving China, Cambodia, and Laos. So with all these different points that I just pointed out, the papermaking traditions, even though it existed 17 centuries ago in Vietnam, the first documentation of that paper, has been extremely displaced. The information has been displaced, the culture has been displaced, the craft is at risk of being, is really endangered right now because of globalization. But the history of the paper is known as Zay Zaw. In the north, that's what it's called. But in the south, they call it Ye Yaw. So it's a little bit different in the accents. And so Zay Zaw was traditionally a paper used in Vietnam for folk painting, sending royal manuscripts from royal family to the imperial court, to the king. It's widely used for ancestral burning, and that's common in Tet, the Lunar New Year, and also in the Autumn New Year Festival. These are images of Hanoi in 1926. And I want to go through these images because it's just really incredible. Every single person in this street in Hanoi, this is in the Yen Thai village, near the river there, is selling Zay Zaw paper. And it is you can see the rich history that handmade paper has in Vietnam. And just since the 1920s, also in the 1980s, there was still some paper making areas, but not as common. And a lot of the families would live close to a body of water or running water because you need water as a resource for making paper. So it was either rinsing the fiber, using it for daily life, or for cleaning the fibers for paper making. And so this image is just so precious. It's showcasing all the families that are making traditional Zay Zaw paper. Here's a family it's still traditionally done. You beat the fibers by hand. So this is an image of a family beating the fibers by hand. You fast forward to 2023 and Hanoi doesn't look like this anymore. It is actually, you won't find any paper making in the city centers, even though every single family used to practice traditional handmade paper in Vietnam. And it's just a reminder to see like what is the state of craft right now and what happened to the handmade papermaking traditions in Vietnam because of globalization. And so Hanoi, which was the epicenter for papermaking in Vietnam, the craft has been pushed out to an area called Bac Ninh, and it's about 2 hours northwest, and there's only one family practicing Zazal paper now. And just to give us more of a framework, in case we didn't know where we are, there's Hanoi and Bac Ninh, and then there is the red dot is where the north is in relation to China and the rest of the world. And so in Bac Ninh, the East Province in Hanoi, there is about 15 people preserving the craft. And even in the 1980s, we still saw about 5,000 people practicing handmade paper. But now there's only 15 people within the family, and then there's other people that are helping the family in this area to make traditional paper, but there's only 15 people preserving the craft right now. And the fiber that's used is called zaw, or yaw in the South, and the scientific name is Rhamneuron balanacei, and it's commonly grown in the northern region in Vietnam. And it's used because of its strong durability and its long fibers to weave a sheet of paper together. And similar to washi, if you have any knowledge and understanding like paper making, washi is really well known in Japan, and they use kozo because of that same characteristic, similar characteristic in that it's durable and they have really long fibers to hold this sheet of strong paper together. So in Bac Ninh, if you go to this area, it is no longer like a lot of people practicing paper making. You'll find a lot of manufacturing and industrialized paper making for different ceremonies. These are being printed for the autumn new year for ancestral burning and ritual worship. And so these are the centers that you're going to find paper. It's been kind of replaced with industrialized paper making. Zaw is collected from the northern region, and then the family will scrape the outer bark to the inner bark. And the zaw fiber is actually located in this area here in the west. So as you see, the zaw fiber is growing away from even the families that are making traditional Zazal paper. So you see this displacement, you see this kind of disconnect between paper making and then fiber. So with Hanoi being in the center, you can see how like the industrialization has just pushed everything out. And even with climate change, zaw, the fiber, is having there's not as much cultivation of it because of climate change, but also because it's a little bit harder to grow with our changing climate. So there is specifically like a community here that are growing and trying to cultivate the zaw for the families that are still practicing traditional paper making. These are the tools that are used for traditional paper making. On the left is called the lim sao, which is the bamboo woven screen. And then on the right is a two-part frame. And these are the equipment that are used for traditional paper making. In this family in Bac Ninh, they dry the papers on their walls of their home. And I'll show a video shortly here, but it's 3 floors in their house, and it's all committed to making paper and drying papers on the wall. And it's a reminder that this craft is very much has been passed down from tradition to generation to generation, and it has been a really rich tradition in this specific family's home. I want to highlight these makers because these are the remaining crafts makers in Hanoi, in the northern region, that are using the sao technique for paper making, which is how you form a sheet. This is the terminology for pulling a sheet of paper. And so on the left is Bac Thai, which is the bamboo screen weaver, and then Bac Huan, which is the Kung Sao craftsman. And they are really carriers of this craft. Without these two producing this equipment and sharing their knowledge, we wouldn't have handmade paper in Vietnam anymore. So they are just national treasures, and I wanted to highlight them. This is a quick video to kind of show you where the location of the papermaking family lives in Bacning. So when you walk into their home, you have the industrial papermaking like in all these different nooks and crannies, and then you walk in and you are immediately greeted by this masterful paper maker that has been making paper since she was 13. And she can form a sheet in 23 seconds. So all of my friends have said, like, if you go visit her, you need to count because it's always been 23 seconds. And of course, it was 23 seconds to form a sheet of paper and to put it on the on the paper post. And so she is working, she makes about 1,000 sheets a day. And this is this family's livelihood. They produce this paper every day. And that's her daughter on the lower right there. And then there's other women that are employed in this community that will help out with the papermaking process because it is super labor intensive and it requires lots of hands to make one sheet of paper even. So this is after it's been pressed, you can separate the sheet of paper. And you can really handle it after all the water's been pressed. And in this home, you can see the archive and the collection of papers in the home, and it's absolutely stunning. It is just from floor to ceiling, it's just paper and memories of paper. And the yellow that you see on the walls there, that's for royal manuscripts that were used, and they'll make those papers as well. So this is the process of drying a stack on the wall. There's about 50 sheets that go up onto one post, and then it is dried with a larger sheet on top. And then it'll take anywhere from 1 to 2 weeks, depending on the humidity in Vietnam, to see how long. But you'll have 50 sheets in one stack on the wall. And so the papers that they're producing a lot of them are being made for the Dong Ho paintings, which is traditional Vietnamese folk paintings. And before, Zazor would be used for children's mask making. And so this is a big festival during Tet, the Lunar New Year. But now it's been replaced by industrialized paper. So right now we see Zazor still being used for folk painting, but the purposes of the paper are kind of, they're decreasing, and it's not seen as much in different types of activities for Tet. The next type of fiber that I'm going to talk about, it's called zezung, which is a type of paper fiber that is common to mulberry. So we have our own kind of invasive mulberry in the US, and this type of fiber, which is similar to zaw, grows very abundantly in Vietnam. So I was able to study with this family in Hoa Binh, which is west of Hanoi. And they are actually a Muong ethnic minority group in the West Province. And they are collecting zung for making sheets of handmade paper. And zung grows wildly all over the North region. It can be cultivated all throughout Vietnam as well. And there are currently only 5 people preserving this craft. When I say 5, I mean the family and the household that are commonly practicing it, but there are families that will help when they're making paper. And so this group specifically, they are rice and pig farmers. So during the off seasons, they'll be able to make paper to sell, and they work with other social enterprises like the ZAW project in order to make commission-based papers with. Here's another video. So I got to work intensely with this papermaking family, and we hiked up the jungle and we harvested the zung in the mountains, and it was about a 40-minute hike. So once you get up there, you have to cut down the branches and then scrape the bark. And so this is the first step in paper making, is to be able to harvest and collect this fiber. And it's a 40-minute hike down. And after that, you bring it home and you scrape the outer bark with the inner bark. And the inner bark is what you normally use for paper making, but you can also use the outer bark. You're just going to get a little bit more texture in the paper. And once that's done, you soak it in water before the cooking process, and then it's cooked in a lime solution. And the lime helps break down the cellulose in the paper. And during this time, it's stoked with fire and it's cooked in a large pot for about 24 hours. and you turn the fiber over every hour or so. So while you're doing this, you're also continuing to scrape the bark. So there's we spent about 4 weeks, just kind of 4 days, just like scraping the outer bark and then cooking it. And after that, we have to clean the bark and to get ready for the beating process. It's normally beaten by hand with a mallet. And then there is a tool that helps separate the fibers after you beat it by hand to kind of fluff up the fibers. And this is a video of Bak Ho. She is actually forming a sheet of paper right now. And she is my teacher. She's the one that taught me how to make traditional paper. And so once the sheet has been pulled from the vat with the pulp, it is put on a post, and we call this in paper making kuching. And you put that all on a stack together, and you continue to do this to build up your post. Once the post has been totally done, you actually press it with a manual press to get all the water out. And then after that, you're pretty much able to handle the paper right after that. The hydrogen bonds have connected again, and it's like holding like a damp paper towel. It's ready to be dried in the sun and separated. And so this family doesn't have like porous or plaster walls for drying, so they actually dry their papers in their driveway. And then after that, they're able to calendar the sheets just to make it flat with like a ceramic bowl. In printmaking, it's common to kind of put it through a large press, but they use a ceramic bowl to just kind of get out the wrinkles, and we call it calendaring. And so Baho, my teacher, I was really, really excited to kind of get my hands into this craft. This is going to be the first time I learned how to make my own Vietnamese paper. And I was really excited, but it quickly got very serious after that, because I learned that it is a very hard technique to learn. And there's no way I could have mastered it in the time that I was there, because it takes a lifetime to learn this craft. And so this was my view during my my residency and learning with the paper makers there. And I made my first post, my paper making post, and I dried it in the sun. And there's my proud sheets of paper drying out in the sun. We also I experimented a little bit with Zaw Project and the papermaking family that I worked with natural dyes. And there's a rich tradition of indigo dyeing in Vietnam. So we experimented with indigo, we experimented with galanga root and other pigments here, other plants to get like an orange and pink dye. There is also another type of papermaking that exists that we were able to learn about, is called che, which is a type of paper that's made with mature bamboo that grows in the northern region. So this area that I'm going to talk about is called Bac Quan, and it's the northern area, and it's the Yao Da ethnic minority community in Ha Giang. And so this family, they're making paper mostly for utilitarian use, mostly for ancestral burning, and then also for napkins. And there's about 96 out of 126 families still preserving this hand paper making tradition. There's a picture of the fiber that grows really abundantly in this district. So with this family specifically, they are using local, like the fiber that's growing really abundantly in this region to make paper for their use, for ancestral burning and for napkins and toiletries. And their process is a little bit different. They don't cook the fiber, they actually soak the bamboo because it's so hardy and it's such a thick fiber. They actually soak the fiber in a lime solution for 3 months in March before making the paper in the summer season. So that picture on the right there is of after the bamboo has been soft enough after the 3 months of it soaking in lime. The equipment is a little bit different as well. It's longer. And so in the Yao Viet language, it's called the Che Lin Cha, which is the bamboo frame. And then the woven screen is on the bottom there. And so we have different makers in this region that practice this specific type of paper making. And he is also the man on the left, Bak Fin. He is the last bamboo weaver in this region that practices this type of paper making. So again, you see only one tool maker being able to continue this craft and supply this equipment to the families in this region. And the man on the left, Bakpu, he invented the loom there. And he is actually the teacher for Bak Fin. So you can see like they're older, and no one actually else wants to learn how to weave this craft anymore. And so you see the age is also kind of an issue with passing down the craft, and how hand paper making traditions can be passed down from generation. And this family specifically, they have been making paper for 4 generations, but it dates back a little bit further. And so it was a very magical moment to be able to talk with this family, because they situate near the river, and this is their home. They're actually making paper right by the river, just like we were talking about in the beginning, where traditional families would live near a body of water to make paper. And so when we visited them in July, they were making thousands of sheets a day to prepare for trading with different communities, for napkins, for toiletries, for the Autumn Moon Festival, and for trading different resources with each other. So the technique is different. It's 2 different types of dips in order to form a sheet. And then it's couched on top of the post there. And the stack is about 1.5 feet high. And it's really quite remarkable. You can see the differences in the length of the sheet too. And a different type of mucilage is actually added to the solution in order to make a sheet of paper to get a thin sheet. And this is a fiber that is grown around their region. And once they soak it, they're able to strain out the mucilage to add into the vat of paper in order to form thin, even sheets. And so this natural material is added into the vat and then mixed in with the pulp in order to form each sheet and each layer. So this is a blender that this community actually developed. So it breaks down and kind of blends the fibers, and then it becomes a pulp. And that's when you mix it into the vat with the mucilage in order to form a sheet of paper. So this is all one family, and this was another, she also lived here, and she was also forming, there was 2 different sections in this area where they were making paper posts like 2 feet high. It was quite incredible to see. And so they'll drain their papers through different weights. They have a suspension system, but they'll continue on the post the next day to keep working and making paper. And so this is a separation process after the water has been drained. And it's separated into 5 sheets, 5 stacks, and then it's put onto an area where it's going to be laid out into the sun to dry. And so after those 5 sheets have been placed together, those stacks are then laid out on a tarp or on the ground, and it's ready to be dried and packaged. And so this family, they're using their papers as napkins as for livelihood, but they're also able to trade these resources with everyone in their community in this region. When we were having lunch with everyone, they kept saying like, use the paper for napkins. And I just felt so, I felt like I almost couldn't use the paper as a napkin, because I'm so trained to like think about the process of handmade paper and the work that goes into it. But this is their tradition. This is their livelihood. This is what they use instead of using commercially made toiletries. They're using it in their daily life and for their livelihood. And so that's the picture of me after I've used it as a napkin during our meal. And then the photo on the right here is actually, there's different, based on your ethnic minority group, there's different ways of cutting up the paper for ritual worship or for burning. And so this one, there's the motifs kind of symbolize the chicken feathers that are on top. And these are rituals that are done for our ancestors, for like wealth or prosperity, or for good fortune. And so it was such an incredible time to be able to conduct fieldwork here, but then also learn from these masterful paper makers. And this is kind of the paper trail, just being able to see what the tradition is in Vietnam and the state of it, and also how it relates to my own cultural identity and learning this craft again, and to see the celebration of it, but also the much needed efforts that we need to be able to preserve handmade papermaking traditions in Vietnam. In May, this is a part of a group exhibition called Between Memory, and it's a celebration of hand papermaking traditions in Vietnam. So I covered the gallery walls in paper, and the materials that I used were local mulberry and hemp. And it's really an invitation to be able to kind of allow people to question what is it and what is this craft, and be able to celebrate it in a space that we don't normally see paper being displayed. And it was 3 parts to this installation. One part is the visual, is the handmade paper and like practicing this tradition. And each paper is handmade in my studio, and every paper is a little bit different. It's not perfect. It's not meant to be perfect, but it's really a story about this process and this celebration of Vietnamese paper making. In the center, there is a piece. I'm gonna pause that for a second. There's a piece made out of mulberry, and they're kind of simulating a meal that you would share if you went to Vietnam. And so it's also made with the same materials. It's made out of mulberry, or in Vietnamese, it's called zung. And you can cast different objects. So here I have different, I have a tea set, I have teapots and bowls, and I'm inviting the viewer to kind of look at this tradition, but also share this meal with me, and be able to kind of appreciate what this craft is trying to tell us. And I have a short video here. I did a collaborative soundscape with my friend Denise Hoffman, and she kind of made sounds with the sounds that I collected from Vietnam and also in my studio. That's a little snippet of the soundscape that we created, but when you walk into the installation, you can also hear the soundscapes that were collected and designed together. And so here's kind of a close-up of this work. And so this piece was titled Across Oceans. So it's made out of bark lace and handmade paper. And you can kind of see this meal that I'm talking about. I was also able to conduct some workshops. This one was at the Chazen Museum last fall. And so everyone was able to make a sheet of paper. And it's kind of like a cooking show. I had the pulp ready for making sheets of paper, but then I also had fiber where people could beat the fiber. And then I had a stack that was already pressed, so people were able to brush it on the windows. And they were able to get their hands dirty in the process to learn about this tradition. And so this is the windows in the Chasing meeting area. And then another picture of it outside drying. I just recently conducted a workshop at the Minnesota Center for the Book Arts, and everyone was able to experiment with this one fiber. This one is a regional kozo, which is a mulberry that's growing in Florida. And I showed the videos of scraping the outer and the inner bark. We were able to utilize the outer bark, the inner bark, and well, there's 3 parts of the mulberry. with the bark. So it's called black bark, which is the most outer bark, the green bark, which is the middle bark, and then the inner white bark, which is traditionally what you would use for making like really fine sheets of paper. So we were able to use all three of them. And this is a little video of everyone making Zezung paper in the workshop. So everyone was able to practice this sail technique of making traditional Vietnamese paper with the equipment. And so you can kind of see some of the speckles, and that's from the outer and the outer bark. That looks really great. And you always have to be encouraging when you're doing workshops. And then here we also dry, so there's no plaster or concrete walls for us to dry the papers on, so we can dry it on the windows. So we were able to fill the workshop space with with paper. And the results were a beautiful collection in a library that people were able to walk away with, learn the technique, learn about the tradition, and then walk away with their own library of papers. I worked closely with ZAW Project, so this is kind of my, this work is not possible without my friend Chen Hong Nhung from ZAW Project, working to preserve papermaking traditions in Vietnam. She works with different ethnic minority groups as well in order to celebrate their tradition and their papermaking process. And then in the end, there's also different products and different designs that she'll come up with through the ZAW Project. And then I also want to highlight Trúc Chỉ, which is where I did my residency. Phan Hai Bang from Trúc Chỉ in Hue is working to bring a new culture of paper arts, craft, printmaking, and graphic design into the culture in Vietnam. Because of this loss of papermaking traditions, he's kind of come up with a project to celebrate this in Hue, bridging traditional papermaking process with different types of printmaking designs. So you can kind of see in this installation on the left, these beautiful objects that are created through this technique. I also want to highlight a close collaborator, James Ojacastra from WashU. He's done a lot of work in identifying the different species in Vietnam. So we know that ZAW is this scientific name, Zung is this scientific name, and then all the different, the work that he's done with working with different ethnic minority groups to identify which fiber is which when they're working with it. And I think the greatest collaborator of all has to be my dad. And this has been the most rewarding collaboration. It's being able to go back to Vietnam to conduct this field work. I felt it's such a blessing, and I just feel so thankful that I get to go back to learn about my own heritage, but also listen to the story that's very similar to a lot of like refugee and immigrant parents, but it's being able to hear these stories, if it relates to craft, about their displacement or about how they're lost, but just to be able to listen to these stories again. And now I feel in some way it feels that papermaking is deeply connected to who I am as a Vietnamese person. So yeah, I just want to thank you. Thank you everyone for being here.
Oh my gosh, that was so much fun. I loved everything about that, especially the videos. That was really, really cool to see it live. I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording, but we can have some time for Q&A if anybody online or anybody in person has some questions for Ms. Veronica.